Welcome to the post-haircut world, and welcome to the YouTube version of the sermon for Whitley Lodge Baptist Church for the 12th of July 2020. And if you are part of Whitley Lodge, then you'll be watching it probably as a matter of course. If you're not, can I just say welcome, and I hope that my ramblings are of some use to you. The wonderful thing is, at any point when you get bored, you can simply turn me off. We are working our way through the book of 2 Corinthians, or if you're watching from the other side of the pond, 2 Corinthians, and we're going to read a background verse, a background passage, I should say, and then we are going to read 2 Corinthians chapter 3. So the background passage is found in Exodus 34, and you might want to keep your finger in the page for Exodus 33 and 34. And actually, what I'll do for the YouTube version, I'll read all of the relevant bits of this. So starting with Exodus 33 and verse 15, this is Moses talking to God and feeling inadequate and asking God to help him, and that Moses would know his presence. So Exodus 33 verse 15. Then Moses said to God, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." And the Lord said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion." But he said, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Then the Lord said, "There is a place near me where you may stand on a rock. When my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will remove my hand and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen." And then moving on to chapter 34, verse 6. And the Lord passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin." And then moving on to verse 29. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant, because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. But Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterwards, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. And when he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord. Now, as I said, keep your finger in there because you might find it useful. I was going to put something in there to hang on to it. I'm going to blow my nose, so I'm not skipping all the way through the next reading. Excuse me, my nose gives me trouble, especially around this time of year. It's the harvesting the fields, starting to harvest the fields all around here. Anyway, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 3. And we'll read the whole chapter, even though we're going to focus on the end bit of it. Are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, like some people, letters of recommendation to you or from you? You yourselves are our letter, written on our hearts, known and read by everyone. You show that you are a letter from Christ, the result of our ministry, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of the living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. Such confidence we have through Christ before God. Not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. He has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now, if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought the condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. And if what was transitory came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull. For to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now, the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. One of the things that you notice as you travel around a bit is that so many church buildings and church assemblies, for that matter, are designed to impress you with their magnificence. Of course, that's fairly obvious with some buildings. One of my very, very favourite church buildings in the whole world is Sacré-Cœur in the Montmartre district of Paris. It is the most incredibly magnificent building. I first went there, more years ago than I can remember. I've been since. It is a wonderful place, and I sat in the back of the church, and down at the front there was a priest doing his thing. I'm not quite sure what his thing was, but it was magnificent. The setting was just stunning. The size, the scale, the beauty, the artwork, the sheer design, the acoustics of the place are absolutely incredible. And I remember saying to my wife, I bet nobody argues with him very much. That guy at the front, the priest. But the building is designed to impress. And of course, also in Paris, you have Notre Dame, which is being restored at great expense as we speak. Buildings designed to impress. In my part of the world, probably the outstanding building is Durham Cathedral, which is huge in its scale, magnificent in its style. And what does it do? Why is all of that? What is all of this large scale beauty all about? All the intricate stained glass windows, the huge pillars, speaking of strength, and the layout of the high altar and all the rest. What's all that about? What are people trying to do? Well, I'd like to think that what they're trying to do is they're trying to say something about the glory of God. They're trying to say something in purely architectural and human terms about how incredible is the glory of God. And this is the nearest we can come to expressing it in stone and mortar and all the other things that go to make the building. But of course, there's a part of me also that says sometimes it isn't just about that. I used to work in a church in Leicester that was built in the late 19th century, and it started life. Well, I worked in this as an ecumenical church, but it started life as a Methodist church building, and it had a huge pointy tower reaching right up into the sky. You don't often see that in nonconformist churches, and I wondered why it was. It was a real pain in the neck because pigeons had got into it, and the artificial floor halfway up the tower was, and I say this quite literally, was knee deep in pigeon droppings. Iguana, I think they call them, and it cost a fortune to have it cleared. And I said, what is that tower for? And then I read something of the history of the churches along Clarendon Park Road, the street in which it was set. As you would expect, the Church of England were the first people there with a fairly impressive building, but with a relatively modest little spiky tower thing in the middle. They built their building in 1885. A year later, the Congregationalists, or probably Independents, not quite sure, no, Congregationalists, I think then, the Congregationalists came along. They felt they had to compete, so they built this incredibly impressive facade and plugged themselves literally next door to the parish church. The Baptists were next in 1892, and they wanted to compete as well, so they built themselves a little tower and a very impressive frontage to say, we're the Baptists and we're here. And last of all came the Johnny-come-latelys. The Baptists were in 1892. I should say, incidentally, that the irony of this is that the Baptist Church is now a Sikh Gurdwara, and so it's impressing people with the Sikh faith rather than with the Baptist things. And I'm sure the people who had that church building made would be turning in their graves. That's another story. But in 1895, along came the Methodists, because everybody was planting a church in this growing residential suburb of the city of Leicester. And the Methodists, not to be outdone, decided to build what I think they probably reckon was the most impressive tower to say, we are the Methodists and we are here. And of course, it ends up being knee-deep in pigeon dung. And if we're honest, what churches are often trying to do is to pretend that they're doing things to the glory of God. But what they're really doing is trying to impress people with their own significance and importance, and perhaps that they have the real truth. Sometimes there's a sort of modern version of this in modern independent churches, which are often housed in purpose-built auditoria that look very impressive. And if you watch them on YouTube, you'll see the camera angles are designed to impress you with scale, with the quantity of people who are in the building, listening attentively to the preacher strutting his stuff. And actually, what it's all about, what this whole almost theatrical set is all about, is impressing people not with the glory of God, but with the importance of the people who are performing on the stage. And sometimes these sort of myths are perpetuated. And because there is a problem, isn't there? And it's the most fundamental problem that we have as Christians, that we have as church leaders, is that we talk about God. We talk about God a great deal. We talk about what God is like. We talk about the Bible, God's word, what God has said to us. We talk about what God has done in creation and in Jesus. But actually, we never get to see God. and this is stating the blindingly obvious. but it's an issue, isn't it? Because on one level, at the very fundamental level, people might say to us who don't believe, well, you believe in God. Well, show me God and then I can believe in him. But we can't see God. And so here is the dilemma. We have to speak about God. We have to try to demonstrate who God is. But actually, nobody gets to see him. Not even Moses properly got to see him. And of course, what we really want to say is, if you want to know God, then you can know him, you can meet him, but just not in a physical sense. A couple of weeks ago now, my wife and I went to Northern Ireland. Lynn, as most of you will know her by, went to Northern Ireland. The reason we went to Northern Ireland was that our latest grandchild, Joshua, was born just as the lockdown came and we weren't able to get across. And 4 months have passed. In that 4 months, our daughter and our son-in-law put loads of pictures on the internet about Joshua and our family Facebook page and so on. We had pictures of Joshua. We could even hear Joshua because he's quite a noisy baby. And our daughter, our son-in-law, would talk about him, talk about what he was like, and part was just itching, desperate to get to meet him. But however much you talk about Joshua, we don't really know him. And then 2 weeks ago, we got to go to Northern Ireland, and we physically met Joshua, our grandson, and we held him, and we saw firsthand his quirks, his personality, and all the things that make him, even at the age of 4 months, an utterly unique individual. And it was very, very exciting. And now we can say we know Joshua because we have met him. And you see, it is no good simply talking about God. What we have to do is to meet him and to encounter him, but we can't see him physically. And this is what the last verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 3 are really all about. It's incredibly relevant, isn't it, that it talks about face coverings, veils, and so on. And we're in the middle of a debate about face coverings at the minute, so it's really interesting that Paul here is talking about veils. So Paul talks about Moses going into meet with God, and it was like this. Moses said to God, I want to know that it's you. I want to know that this is not somehow my imagination or a myth, but actually that you, the God of the universe, know me and have called me, and that in some way I'm special. I have to meet with you in some way. And God said to him, you can't see my face. We're dealing here with largely with metaphors of a bygone age, which sees things very differently from how we do now. We're talking about events of more than 3,000 years ago. And so God sets up this system, and Moses gets to see the disappearing part of God. And then, but Moses is able to hear God's voice when he goes to meet him. But here's a problem. You see, when Moses comes out from meeting with God, his face is absolutely blindingly radiant, so radiant that it scares the people. So he wears a veil. Now, why did Moses wear a veil after he came out of the temple? Well, Paul deals with this when he came out of the temple. He wasn't a temple in those days. When Moses came out from meeting from the tabernacle, from meeting in the presence of God. So it wasn't even a tabernacle, was it? It was up the mountain. Anyway, Moses went to meet with God, and so Paul deals with it in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 13. We are not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. And what does Paul mean by that? Now, this is the really interesting, because we use the word end in exactly the same way as Greek uses it. The Greek word is telos, from where we get things like telescope and so on. But the word end can mean the finish of something, or it can mean the goal of something. And so what is Paul saying here? What is Paul saying? Moses put a veil over his face so that the Israelites wouldn't see the fading glory, the end of the glory of God on Moses' face, or in order to prevent them from perceiving God in the face of Moses. Now, the way Paul uses it, almost certainly Paul is speaking about the fading glory of God. The reason the veil was on was because the glory of God was fading, was passing away. And then Paul uses this. Paul takes some liberties with Exodus 34 here, as Paul often did. Paul often did take liberties with the Old Testament. And Paul says, now this is like the veil that is on people's hearts. Verse 14, their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed, because only in Christ is it taken away. Even to this day when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. And Paul says it's like the veil of Moses has been transferred to these people. Now, the ultimate expression of this veil was the curtain in the temple in Jerusalem, which separated off metaphorically the presence of God from the people. And only the high priest was allowed once a year to go behind the curtain into the presence of God. And you may remember that little line in the story of the crucifixion of Jesus, where it says the curtain of the temple was torn in two. And you might think, well, that's a shame. It's a way of ruining a nice curtain. Now, the significance of this is that all of a sudden, access to the presence and the glory of God is laid open for everyone. Everyone now has access to that place which previously was reserved only for the high priest. So the veil has gone. But, says Paul, and he's speaking here particularly of his own people, the Jewish people who have not found faith in Jesus. He's saying that, but there's still a veil, and the veil is on their hearts, and they can't perceive the glory of God. And so Paul goes on to develop this theme. You see, what happened when the temple curtain was torn in two? Well, effectively, they cut out the middleman. You no longer need anybody to represent you before God. You have access to God himself. You can now be in the presence of God. You can behold his glory and his presence and his beauty, and you can know him in the way that Moses knew him. And why wouldn't you want that? And Paul says, well, sadly, there's a veil over the hearts of these people. But people might say, well, tell us, Paul, how does this work? Because Moses was allowed to see the back parts, as it were, of God and talk to God face to face. How does that work for us? How do we behold the Lord? And this is what Paul addresses in verse 17. Now, the Lord is the Spirit. Put simply, Paul is saying God the God of Moses, we might say perhaps God the Father, although even that may be slightly dodgy theology, but God the Father, but God the Lord is the Spirit, meaning the Holy Spirit. God the Father and God the Spirit are one. And where the Spirit of the Lord is, where God's Spirit is, there is freedom or liberty. And the freedom is the freedom to know the presence of the glory of God. And we have that freedom. And then verse 18, and we all, who with unveiled faces, in other words, the veil is gone, we don't have to wear one, unlike going into shops in Scotland and probably England in the quite near future. We don't have to wear a mask on our faces. We don't have to wear a veil, because the veil of the curtain was torn in two. With unveiled faces, we contemplate the Lord's glory. Now, the word contemplate here has two meanings, much as it's sometimes translated reflect. The Greek word is actually quite unusual. It's not used in many places, and so it's quite difficult to determine precisely what it means. Does it mean reflect as in reflect on and contemplate, which is one meaning of the word, or does it reflect meaning that we give off the glory of God? Or can I be really greedy and say, can it be both? So that it's as we reflect on God in our relationship with him and speak to him and learn about him, it's as we do that we increasingly, as it were, give off the beauty of the glory of God. We reflect the Lord's glory. And how do we know that we have met with God? Well, how do we know that this glory is real? Well, we know because our lives are transformed. We, with unveiled faces, reflect, contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory. Now, I'm just going to pause there because I'm aware that one or two of the people that I do New Testament Greek with might be watching this. And so I'm going to say, last week we were doing prepositions, and two of the prepositions we did are incredibly well illustrated here. So I'm just going to pause and do a little bit of a Greek lesson. With ever increasing glory is literally from glory into glory. And the first preposition is apo, which you will remember if you've done Greek with me, means from, and it takes a genitive. So it's apodoxes. Doxa is one of those feminine nouns where the alpha changes to an eta in the genitive singular. Apodoxes, and then ice. Remember ice into, which always takes the accusative. Yes, you got that. So apodoxes, ice, doxan, because in the accusative the alpha remains an alpha. So this is a wonderful illustration, wonderful example of Greek use of prepositions. But the point of it is that we are being transformed from glory into glory. And I do wish that the modern version of the NIV reflected that. We're not, the glory isn't a continuum. It is, we're going from something to something. The glory of God in our lives should increase over time as we reflect on being in the presence of God. And so you might say, so when you say, well, going back to the original question, how do we know that God's there? How do we know what God is like when we can't see him? And the answer to that is when the Holy Spirit enters our hearts and our lives our lives are transformed. Now, the reflecting takes some work. Reflecting means spending time, submitting our lives constantly to the will of God, saying, God, what do you have for me? What do you want from me? And particularly accepting that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to grow and to increasingly reflect the glory of God. And it should be the case that our lives are spent as we spend time with God, as we experience the presence of the Holy Spirit in our lives. We understand more about God and we go from one stage of glory to another. The glory is not ours, the glory is God's. Now, you and I all have a responsibility. If we are Christian believers, we have a responsibility for our lives to reflect the glory of God. It should be the case that people look at the way we live, the way we speak, the way we conduct ourselves, and they look at us and they say, there is something of the glory of God about that person, and that glory is increasing. If you are a mature Christian, you should be growing in the glory of God. As we get older and older and older, it should more and more be the case that people see more and more of the glory of God in us. I used to, before lockdown, I used to go to the gym about 3 times a week. And I would always try to go around about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And the reason I'd go at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is a particular chap used to come to the gym about then. And this guy his physique was incredible. His upper half was almost triangular in shape. And he had huge rippling muscles, his biceps, his chest, his six-pack, everything was muscle. I got talking to him one day, and it was a bit of a sad story, actually. But the sadness of the story was that he was a single chap, and he liked to have lots of different and he recognised that as he was getting older, it was becoming increasingly difficult to attract them. And so he had to keep his body in shape, or otherwise he wouldn't be able to carry on attracting women as he got older. That was his motivation for keeping this incredible physique. Now, I didn't have that motivation, but he was my motivation, because whilst I know I will never, ever look anything like that, that's my model, and if I keep that in my head, it will help me to keep working at getting my body into a better and better shape, because that is what I'm aiming for. Now, that's an illustration of how we should be. Ultimately, our model is Jesus, being transformed to become more and more and more like Jesus. I know it's a well hackneyed phrase these days, because wristbands that people wear say WWJD, what would Jesus do? Actually, it's really good. How would Jesus deal with this? How would Jesus address this situation? What would Jesus say in this situation? And of course, we will fail, but we should also aim to become more and more and more reflective of the glory of Jesus. And our lives should become more and more of a reflection of that glory. And here's a particular challenge. If you're like me and you're getting on a bit, and you've been a Christian, I've been a Christian now for more than half a century. And I'm aware that my life nowhere near reflects the goodness and the glory of God. But I should be. You and I, if we are mature Christians, we should be like that guy in the gym, not in terms of chasing women, I mean, but in terms of being something that other Christians aspire to. something that other people look at and say, there is something special and different about that person, and I want to be like that. And sadly, churches all too often contain Christians who have become bitter and cynical as they've grown older. That isn't God's intention for us. The intention is that we are transformed from one degree of glory to another, and it's an upward progression as we aim to emulate the model of the glory that we see in the life of Jesus Christ. And the Spirit, God's Spirit, who is God within us and God with us and God around us and God in our church, motivating, driving, equipping us, filling us. The Spirit is the person who enables us to be so transformed, if that is our heart's deepest desire. So my desire for you, my yearning for you and for me, is that we are ever more motivated, that our lives reflect this glory of God, the glory epitomized in the life of Jesus, and that in so doing we change from one degree of glory to the next, and we become more and more like Jesus, so that people are increasingly and irresistibly attracted to the glory of God that they see in our lives. I pray that for you. I pray that for me. I have an awful long way to go. Perhaps you don't have quite so far, but it would be great, wouldn't it, if as we develop, perhaps this week, perhaps this month, perhaps before our next birthday, our lives can become better reflections and better attractions of the glory of God in human flesh. So I pray that for you. I pray that for me. Thank you for listening. It's been great being with you, and probably see you next week, I imagine. Bye.